You think you know what slavery was. You've heard of the transatlantic trade, ships crossing the ocean, chains, whips, cotton fields. That's the story we're allowed to remember. But what if I told you that was just one chapter? A much bigger, much darker story lies buried under 1,000 years of silence. A story of empires that thrived on stolen children, mutilated bodies, and erased cultures. A system so vast, so industrial, that it makes the horrors you've heard of look like fragments of a nightmare. For over 1,200 years, a global slave trade stretched from the Sahara to the Indian Ocean, from the Balkans to Zanzibar. It didn't just steal people, it annihilated civilizations. And the strangest part, most history books won't even mention it. Let's go back to the 7th century, when Arab armies burst out of the Arabian Peninsula. With religion as justification and conquest as strategy, slavery wasn't just tolerated, it was institutionalized. Unlike the transatlantic system that lasted about 400 years, this trade lasted over a millennium. 1,000 years of raids, markets, and forced conversions. Victims came from everywhere: Black Africans from the Sahel and East Africa, white Europeans from the Mediterranean coast, Slavic peoples, so many that the very word slave comes from Slav Indians and Persians captured in raids. This was not just about labor, it was about control. Entire populations became resources to be harvested, broken, and erased. Now picture this: a quiet Balkan village, early 1500s. The church bells don't ring for prayer, they ring in warning. Ottoman soldiers are marching in, families know what's coming. The dreaded Devshirme, the child levy. Boys aged 8 to 18 are dragged from their homes. Mothers screaming, fathers begging, children clinging to door frames. The soldiers line them up in the village square like livestock. Officials check their teeth, test their reflexes, measure their height. They weren't just looking for children, they were looking for specimens. Strong, intelligent, obedient. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a bureaucratic system. Manuals written on how to judge a child's worth. If selected, that boy would never see his family again. Not in a week, not in a year, not ever. The first step: isolation. The boys were separated from anyone who spoke their language. The second, reprogramming. They were given new names, forbidden from speaking their mother tongue, forced into Islamic education, and drilled in Ottoman military culture. The result? A child erased, a new identity created. And here's the twisted part: these boys weren't just slaves, they became janissaries, the most elite fighting force of the empire. But their loyalty was absolute, not to their families, not to their people, but to the empire that had stolen them. Some even returned to their own villages as conquerors, rifles aimed at the parents who once tucked them into bed. In 1463, the Ottoman levy hit the Serbian village of Gornji Podin. They didn't just take a few boys, they took all of them. Every son between 8 and 18 vanished in a single day. The result? Within one generation, the village collapsed. No sons to plow the fields, no heirs to carry family lines. Within 25 years, the village was abandoned. Archaeologists found houses left with tools still inside, half-plowed fields, churches without maintenance. A culture erased, without a single battle, just the theft of children. But if you think child theft was the worst part, brace yourself, because across Egypt, Syria, and Persia, there were industrial centers for castration. Yes, industrial. Thousands of boys, every year, processed like cattle. Take Aswan, Egypt. Historical records describe facilities where 3,000 to 5,000 boys were mutilated annually. The death rate? 90%. 9 out of 10 never walked out alive. Let that sink in. For every 100 boys captured, only 6 or 7 survived the march and the mutilation. The rest were buried in mass graves archaeologists have uncovered near Cairo and Damascus. Pits filled with the skeletons of children between 7 and 16 years old. And here's the sickest part. The operators knew how to make the procedure safer. Byzantine and Persian doctors had techniques with far higher survival rates, but the death rate was part of the business model. Why? Because the fewer survived, the rarer and more valuable they became. The Ledger of Hell. One 13th century merchant's ledger from Damascus reads like an accountant's book from hell. Purchased 100 Nubian boys at 45 dinars each. Transportation, 500 dinars. Castration, 200 dinars. Lost 91 in procedure. Sold 9 survivors at 175 dinars each. Net profit, 275 dinars. Imagine writing off dead children as inventory loss. That was the banality of evil. Barbary Coast, Europe enslaved. But this system didn't only target Africans or Balkan Christians. Between the 1500s and 1800s, Barbary pirates from North Africa terrorized the Mediterranean. Their victims, fishermen from Sicily, villagers from Spain, even as far north as Ireland and Iceland. Historians estimate 1 to 1.25 million Europeans were captured and sold into North African slave markets. Entire coastal towns were abandoned. People stopped living near the shore for fear of being snatched in the night. Imagine being a poor fisherman hauling in nets when sails appear on the horizon. Not traders, not neighbors, but pirates. By the time the village bell rang, it was too late. The men were chained. The women and children marched to ships, gone forever. The Indian Ocean trade, Zanzibar and beyond. Meanwhile, on the eastern side of Africa, the slave trade was booming through Zanzibar. Caravans stretched hundreds of miles into the interior, dragging chained men, women, and children to the coast. They were sold not just to Arabs, but to India, Persia, even as far as China. The routes were brutal. Survivors recalled being whipped, starved, and marched until they collapsed. Those who couldn't walk were simply left to die. By the 19th century, Zanzibar's slave markets sold tens of thousands of Africans every year. And this was centuries after the Atlantic slave trade had already been abolished in the West. Cultural erasure. Here's what people don't realize. This wasn't just about bodies, it was about cultures. Languages wiped out because children never returned to speak them. Villages depopulated, tribal structures shattered. One Ottoman record describes a mother who never spoke again after her son was taken. For 10 years she lived in silence, setting a plate for him at the table every night, talking to an empty chair. Multiply that grief by hundreds of thousands of families across centuries. That's the hidden cost of this system. Why don't we hear about it? Now here's the million-dollar question. Why don't we hear about this? Why do textbooks talk endlessly about the Atlantic trade, but barely whisper about the Arab, Ottoman, and Indian Ocean systems? Systems that lasted 3 times as long and enslaved at least as many, if not more. The answer is uncomfortable, partly because the numbers are hard to document. These empires didn't keep records the way European traders did, partly because acknowledging it would shatter neat narratives of history, but mostly because it's easier to silence uncomfortable truths than to face them. The hidden death toll. Historians estimate that between the Arab, Ottoman, Barbary, and Indian Ocean systems, 12 to 18 million people were enslaved, and when you add in the 90% mortality rate of castration, the marches, the raids, the real death toll could be tens of millions. That's not a footnote in history. That's a Holocaust, stretched over a millennium. Surprised? So now ask yourself, if entire civilizations can be erased, if millions of voices can vanish from history without a trace, if slavery on this scale can be buried in silence, what else don't we know about our past?